Masechet Menaḥot Daf Yod Tet. We last saw a machloket between Rabbanan and Rabbi Shimon about whether a non-Kohen can pour the oil of the Korban Mincha and do the initial mixing. Rabbanan said that yes, a non-Kohen can do it, and Rabbi Shimon says no, it has to be a Kohen. So now we're going to look for the sources. Mai tamad Rabbanan Amar Kera ve'yasak aleha shemen ve'natan aleha lebona והביאה אל בני אהרון הכהן וקמס מכמיסה ואילך מצוות כהונה לימד על יציקה ובלילה שכשרה בזר. The pasuk in Vayikra 2, we could look at the pasukim inside here, where it talks about Korban Mincha. And it says in the beginning, Nefesh ki takrib Korban Mincha ladonai. If a person, anyone, Yisrael, anybody, wants to bring a Korban Mincha, solet ye Korban, he has to bring it from fine flour. Ve'asak aleha shemen venatan aleha lebona, and he has to pour oil upon it. So you see that just from this pasuk it sounds like who's doing the pouring? The nefesh, the owner, the person who's bringing it, does the pouring of the oil and puts the lebona. And then in pasuk 2, vehebi'ah el bnei Aharon kohanim, and then he brings it to the bnei Aharon, the kohanim, vekamas misham melo kumso. Then the kohen has to do the kemisa, mesota mishamna al kol lebonata v'iktir, and he has to burn it on the mizbeach. So you see from here that the initial pouring of the oil and the mixing, that could be done by anybody, by the owner, by a non-kohen. But then from kemitza and on, that has to be done by the kohen. And so, so you learn from here, from the order of the pisukim, that from kemitza and on has to be a kohen. But that means that the first steps of the preparation, the pouring of the oil and the mixing, can be done by azar. That's Rabbanan. Rabbi Shimon. So what's Rabbi Shimon's source to say that it has to be a kohen? Bnei Aharon haKohanim mikra nidrash lefanav ula'acharav. Rabbi Shimon is going to quote the same pasuk. However, he's going to say that a pasuk can be explained both before it and after it. In other words, even though you have the Bnei Aharon HaKohanim here in the beginning of pasuk Bet, nevertheless, so for sure, everybody agrees, of course, that it's going to apply to the things that come afterwards in the pasuk. Rabbi Shimon thinks that you can derive laws not only for the things afterwards, but also for the items before. So you'd read it like a person who brings a korban, he has to bring the solet. Good, very nice. Then the veyasak, he will pour oil. Who is that? It's the person that's mentioned later on, the Bnei Aharon HaKohanim. So Bnei Aharon HaKohanim extends not only forwards, but also extends backwards. That would be Rabbi Shimon's derivation. Now we ask, V'saba Rabbi Shimon mikra nidrash lefanav ulacharav. Does Rabbi Shimon, in general, follow this methodology that you can extend a pasuk both forwards and backwards? A phrase in a pasuk, you can explain that it applies to things that come afterwards in the pasuk and things that come beforehand. V'hatanya v'lakach hakohen midam hachatat be'espa'o v'natan al karnot hamizbeach be'espa'o v'lakach melamed shelo teheh kabbalah ela biyamin be'espa'o v'natan melamed shelo teheh netina ela biyamin. Rabbi Shimon's going to disagree with this. In the Baraita, quoting a pasuk regarding a korban hatat, it says that the kohen will take lakach from the blood of the chatat be'etzba'o with his finger, and he's going to place it on karnot hamizbeach. So now whenever it says be'etzba'o, we learn that has to be with the right hand. Now since it says be'etzba'o ve'lakach, now the word lakach is actually earlier in the pasuk than the word be'etzba'o. Nevertheless, we understand that this taking, lakach, what does it mean taking the blood, is receiving the blood in a vessel during the time of shechita. And that teaches that the Kabbalah has to be with the right hand. The Kohen has to be holding the bowl with the right hand as he receives the blood from the shechita. And then be'etzba'o v'natan. The word natan comes after the word be'etzba'o, and that means that the placement on the corners of the mizbeach has to also be done with the right hand. So that's Tanakama. You see that Tanakama says that even though the word be'etzba'o is in the middle of the pasuk, and certainly it will apply to the next thing, v'natan, the Tanakama says it also applies to velakach. So Tanakama is learning the pasuk both lefanav ula'acharav. However, Amar Rabbi Shimon. V'chi ne'emar yad b'kabbalah, ho'il ve'lo ne'emar yad b'kabbalah, kibel bismol kasher. Rabbi Shimon says, wait a second, does it say the word yad, meaning here the word be'esba'ah? Does it say that regarding the kabbalat adam, the word lakach? No, it doesn't. So you see that Rabbi Shimon here is saying that the word Bespal will tell you a halacha about what comes afterwards in the pasuk, that venatan, but not what comes beforehand in the pasuk. And so he says, since it doesn't talk about the hand of the kohen earlier in the pasuk when it's talking about receiving the blood, in fact, Rabbi Shimon thinks that if one receives the blood holding up a vessel with the left hand, that's okay. So you see here that Rabbi Shimon does not derive a law from earlier in the pasuk, only from later in the pasuk. So it can't be that Rabbi Shimon's derivation that a kohen has to do the pouring comes from this methodology, mikra nidrash lefanav o lacharav, because he doesn't follow this methodology in the case of the blood of the hatat. Ve'amar Abaye, mikra nidrash lefanav o lacharav kamipageh, Rabbi Shimon sabar lacharav nidrashu ulfanav en nidrash. Is the end of the question. Abaye said regarding that baraita that the essence of the machloket in this baraita regarding the receiving of the blood is about whether we've applied this methodology that a pasuk can be interpreted both from the words before it and the words after it. And Rabbi Shimon says you can interpret the words that come after it, but not the words before it. So that can't be the derivation of Rabbi Shimon. So we find a new derivation that Rabbi Shimon says that a kohen has to do the pouring. Ela hainu ta'amad Rabbi Shimon vehebi'ah vav mosif al inyan rishon. And so actually we go back to the same pasuk that we cited before, the word vehebi'ah. So he says it's from this letter vav. Vav comes to say that what comes afterwards in this pasuk adds on to what comes before. And therefore, since it says vehebi'ah el bnei Aaron kohanim, that's saying that what comes before also has to be done by bringing it to bnei Aaron kohanim, that the kohanim have to do not only vekamatz, certainly, but that is add the vav is connecting pasuk bet to pasuk aleph to teach that what's in pasuk aleph, the pouring also has to be done by a kohen. Okay, so this is a new methodology. It has to do with the letter vav. It's not just automatic, everything before and after, but the letter vav connects it so that the things in pasuk aleph also is by a kohen. V'savar Rabbi Shimon vav mosif al inyan rishon. Now we ask this: is that true that Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai applies this methodology that when there's a letter vav, that comes to add the previous matter and connect the previous with the current pasuk? Ela me'ata dichtiv v'shachat et para bakar v'ikribu b'nei Aaron kohanim et hadam v'zariku et hadam mikabala va'elach misvat kehuna melamed al shechita shekeshera bezar l'Rabbi Shimon vav mosif al inyan rishon shechita hachinameh bezar tehe pesula. And so if so, we look at this baraita. This baraita doesn't say it's Rabbi Shimon, but it's universal. Everybody agrees with this law. So the pasuk says, let's take a look at the pasuk inside. That says right before, this is going to be relevant in a second. Samach v'samach yado al rosh ha'olah v'nisal lo lechaper alav. So if someone is going to bring a korban olah, he brings it to Ol Moed, and he does semicha on the head of the korban olah. So it seems that is simply that, and this is in fact the reading, that the owner who brings the korban has to place his hands upon the olah, and that will be acceptable as atonement. V'shachat et ben habakar lifnei Adonai. Now, v'shachat, who's doing this v'shachat? Well, if we continue the pronouns from before, so that would mean that the owner could do the shechita, or maybe anybody. It doesn't say that kohen has to do it. V'hikribu b'nei Aaron kohanim et hadam v'zariku et hadam al mizbeach sabib asher petach ol moed. And only after the shechita, then it says that b'nei Aaron kohanim will bring it close, bring the blood, sprinkle the blood onto the mizbeach. So it seems like from this point on, v'ikribu, then the kohanim have to do it. But what comes before, v'shachat, maybe not. So let's see what this pasuk says, what the derasha says. So according to the pasuk, v'shachat, and then v'ikribu, that means mikabala. The word v'ikribu, we're understanding to be kabbalah, that you're receiving the blood, and you have to receive the blood, and then you have the blood, then you can bring it forth to the mizbech and sprinkle it. So from kabbalah, and then holacha, and then zirika, all those have to be done by a kohen. But that means that only from then on. But before that, the shechita, a non-kohen can do it. That's the derasha in the Baraita, and it's a halacha that's universal. Now, if Rabbi Shimon says that vav mosif al inyan rishon, well then the shechita also should be no good by azar, because then you say here, this vav, vehikrivu ben adon kohanim, this vav is coming to connect this law to the one before. And then you'd say, well, just like you have the kohanim here, that means that also shechita has to be done by the kohanim. But Rabbi Shimon does not say that, so we see that Rabbi Shimon does not apply this methodology. So how could he say he applies that methodology before? And the answer is Shane hatam damar kera v'samach v'shachat masemicha bezarim af shechita bezarim. No, this case is different because it's true you have a vav, and if you only had pasuk 5, then you would interpret the vav as connecting the kohanim to shachat, and that the kohanim has to have to do shechita. But in this case, it's different because pasuk 5 is not the beginning of the process. You have to begin at pasuk 4, and here we have v'samach yado al rosh ha'olah. Now, surely, who's doing semicha? It is the owner, who's not. He could be a kohen. I mean, a kohen can also bring a korban olah, but not necessarily. Most of the time, it'll be a non-kohen who brings a korban olah. And here, the semicha is being done by the owner, who can very well be a non-kohen. And so this says v'samach, and then it goes right into v'shachat. So this v'shachat, although it's true, the vav would be pulling it forwards to the word kohanim. On the other hand, the earlier pasuk v'samach is pulling it backwards, and so therefore the samach yado wins out, and v'shachat just continues v'samach, and that's why in this case we don't apply the vav mosif, but in general we would apply the vav mosif. Now we ask about this answer. Wait a second. If you're going to say that the pronoun of v'shachat is defined not by the vav that comes after it, but rather by the verb v'samach that comes before it, in that case, we should say that just like semicha has to be by the owner, semicha can't just be by anyone. It can't just be by any kohen or any non-kohen or a friend or a cousin. It has to be by the owner who is bringing the korban. He has to do semicha. And so you'd say, just like he has to do semicha, maybe you'll say the shechita has to be done by the owner. You have to do shechita. Now, that's not the halacha, but if really you were deriving samach in order to undo the vav, you're going to say it's the v'samach that goes into v'shachat, and it should be the same person, and that would be the owner. So that's the question. So it's okay, you're right. If we just had that continuation of the Pesukim, you'd say be'alim. However, there's a kal v'chomer that undoes that. The kal v'chomer says, if the sprinkling of the blood, which is the main essential part of atonement, that's the main thing that does atonement, the sprinkling of the blood. And you don't need the owner to do that. In fact, the owner can't do it. It has to be a kohen. Assuming that the owner is not a kohen, so he can't do it. Therefore, if the main part of atonement, of the sprinkling of the blood, is not done by the owner, then shechita, which is not as important. The shechita by itself does not achieve atonement, so it's less important. So all the more so, it will not have to be done by the owner. So this kal v'chomer undoes any idea that you might have that the owner has to do the shechita, and therefore v'samach is true. Samach, that the owner can do, and so the owner does semicha. But the shechita, on the one hand, the samach tells you that it doesn't have to be a kohen, and that is more important than the vav, which connects the word shachat to the continuation of the pasuk, and the v'samach tells you, no, don't connect the v'shachat to the continuation of the pasuk, rather before, but don't go all the way to the other extreme that think that has to be the owner. It means it doesn't have to be a kohen, it can be anybody. And if you say this kal v'chomer is not a good kal v'chomer, you can't derive something that's possible from something impossible. In other words, it's impossible to say that the owner has to do the sprinkling of the blood, because that has to be done by a kohen, and the owner is usually not a kohen. And you can't make a kal v'chomer to learn something. The owner doesn't have to do the shechita because he doesn't have to do the sprinkling. No, that's not a good kal vachomer because he can't possibly do the sprinkling. So you can't, that's not the reason. It's not because the owner is not so important that he doesn't do the sprinkling and therefore all the more so he doesn't have to do the shechita. It's not because it's less important, but rather it's just impossible to ask the owner to do the sprinkling. So you might reject the kal vachomer on those grounds. However, we have a response to that. But the Torah reveals in the laws of Yom Kippur that this is not so, because it says that the Kohen Gadol will do shechita on the par of chatat that is his. He brings the korban chatat. He brings it with his own money, and the Kohen Gadol himself has to do the shechita of his par on Yom Kippur. So since the Torah goes out of its way, in this case, to say that the owner, who is in this case the Kohen Gadol, and he's the one that has to do shechita, we can learn that in general, in other cases, the owner does not have to do shechita. And so actually we can learn from here, even independent of this kal vachomer, we can learn from this derasha that an owner does not have to be the one to do shechita. So once we remove that, we answer this question, and then we can go back to the derivation as we had it before, that although Rabbi Shimon in general does say Vav connects, and the Vav in the pasuk in chapter 2, this Vav is in fact his source to say that the Kohen has to do the pouring of the oil, because this Vav connects V'yatzak aleha to the next pasuk Menaḥot. So Rabbi Shimon does connect Pisukim with a Vav. And that is his derivation. And the fact that we have also in chapter 1, we have Vav ve'shachat, and you might think, and vehikribu. And if you apply it here, then you would come to the conclusion that a Kohen has to do the shechita. But in this case, it's an exception, because we start with the v'samach. And v'samach is a non-Kohen. And don't tell me that, the samach is the owner, because we learned from a derasha of Yom Kippur that only on Yom Kippur the owner has to do shechita. But otherwise the owner doesn't have to do shechita. And so we leave it with just a non-Kohen. And so the v'samach tells you, don't use this vav. In this case, the shachat can be anyone, just like samach can be a non-Kohen, shachat can be a non-Kohen. The Gemara next quotes a statement of Rav. Amar Rav, Kol makom shene'emar Torah vechuka, eno ela le'akev. This is going to lead into a discussion about Korban Mincha, that's why it's here. But Rav gives a general rule that applies to many different subjects, and we're going to see a whole bunch of them, that anytime you have a law in the Torah that mentions the word Torah and the word chukah, that means every single detail in those Pesukim is absolutely necessary in order to fulfill that obligation. Kasalka de'atin tarte ba'ya kedichtib zot chukat haTorah. So our initial understanding of Rav is that the paragraph would have to say both the word Torah and the word chukah, as in fact the Torah does regarding para aduma, where it says zot chukat haTorah, and we learn from there that every single detail of the para aduma preparation is absolutely necessary. If you skip any one of them, it's an invalid para aduma. So, and that is going to be true for other things too. Now we have a siman, natatz yakmal. That's a mnemonic for the issues coming up. The nun is for Nazir. Vahare Nazir delaketi be'ela Torah. Vamarav tenufa benazir me'akeba. Regarding Nazir, the pasuk does say zot Torat hanazir, but it doesn't say the word chukah regarding Nazir. And yet, Rav rules that the waving for a Nazir is necessary. A Nazir brings three different types of korbanot when he's done. One of them is the shelamim, and with part of the shelamim you have to bring 20 loaves of two different types, and you have to wave those together. And that waving is absolutely necessary. If you don't do the waving, then the Nazir tahara procedure is not effective. And now, why should it be me'akev if it doesn't say the word chok there? It only says Torah. And the answer is shane hatam kevan dichtib ken ya'aseh keman dichtib abehu chukah dameh. In the Nazir paragraph, it says you must do it like this. And therefore, those words are the equivalent of it saying chok. And so that's why it's necessary in that case, because it's ken ya'aseh. But in other cases, you would need both Torah and Chukah. All right, next question. Hare Todah de la ketiba be'ela Torah. Regarding a Korban Todah, the Torah only says that this is the Torah of a Korban Todah. It doesn't say the word Chok. Utnan arba'a shebat todah me'akevin ze et ze. The 4 types of loaves that you have to bring for korban todah. Korban todah, you bring an animal, and you also bring 40 loaves. 10 of each different types. 10 are chametz. The other ones are not chametz. And you have to bring all of those different types of loaves. So why should it be necessary if it doesn't say the word chok there? Shaneh todah de'itkash lenazir dichtib al zebach todat shelamav v'amarmor shelamav l'rabot shalmei nazir. And the answer is that todah is exceptional because it is connected to nazir. Regarding korban todah, it says that he brings his offering with the sacrifice of his peace offerings for Thanksgiving. Now you don't have to say that. There's an extra word shelamav. Just say al zivcho, al zevach todah. What's the word shelamav? And when we analyze that, the master taught that the word shelamav is extra to connect todah to nazir, to include shalmei nazir, the korban shalamim, the loaves that you have to bring for korban shalamim for nazir. We learned the halachot of nazir by comparing it to shalamim because of this extra word. So since they are connected to each other, that's how you know that just like nazir, the loaves are necessary, so too regarding todah, the loaves are necessary. So that's how we learn that the loaves are necessary, even though you're right, it doesn't say chok there. Okay, Mesorah also. It doesn't say the word chok, only Torah, and therefore according to Rav's rule, the details should not be necessary. Utnan, arba minim shebe Mesorah me'akebin ze et ze. And yet the Mishnah teaches that the 4 things that you use to bring to sprinkle on the Mesorah, which is a cedar, hyssop, scarlet wool, and birds, you have to have all of those 4 ingredients in order to purify a mesorah. Why should they all be necessary if it doesn't say the word chok? Shaneh hatam kevan dichtib zot tihiyeh torat hamesorah kevan dichtib chukah dameh. There also is exceptional because it has the extra word tihiyeh. You usually just says zot torat. Here tihiyeh means it has to be like this, precisely like this. So the word tihiyeh functions in the same way that chukah would, and from that word we learn that it has to be precisely according to these details. Next question. Now the opposite question regarding laws of Yom Kippur, it says this will be a chok forever, and it does not say the word Torah. Utnan, shene se'ire Yom HaKippurim akebin ze et ze. And yet, the Mishnah teaches that the 2 se'irim of Yom Kippur are necessary. You can't bring the one without the other. You have 2 se'irim with the lottery. One goes to Hashem, one goes to Azazel. You say, I'm just going to bring the one to Hashem, not the other one. No, you need both of them together in order for it to be a valid korban. Now, why should that be? If it doesn't say the word Torah, so why should it be necessary? Ela o Torah o chukah. Okay, you know what? New understanding of Rav. When Rav said the words Torah and chukah, change the and to an or. If it says the word Torah or it says the word chukah, then the details of that law are all necessary. And then we wouldn't need these answers because these all say the word Torah, and this one says the word chukah, so it's one or the other. Hold on. If Torah by itself is going to make the details necessary, then what about all other korbanot, where it says Zot Torah, Ta'olah, B'mincha, and so on, in this pasuk in Vayikra 7:37, a summary pasuk, and it says Torah regarding all different types of sacrifices. But not every detail of every sacrifice is absolutely necessary. But if you say Torah by itself makes everything necessary, then they would be. And the answer is Torah baya chukah v'chukah la baya Torah. No, in fact, if you have the word Torah, you need the word chok also. If you have the word chok, then you don't need Torah. So the truth is that it's really only dependent on having the word chok. With regard to a law, makes all the details necessary. Torah could be there or not, doesn't really matter. Wait, but how can you fit that into the words of Rav? Didn't Rav mention both Torah and chukah? Hachi ka'amad, af agav de kitib Torah, I ketiba chuka in v'i la la. Now what Rav was saying is that even if it has the word Torah, if it has also chuka, yes, then the details are necessary. But if not, without chuka, Torah by itself is not sufficient. That's what Rav was trying to say. והרי מנחה דכתיב בה חוקה, ואמר רב, כל מקום שהחזיר הכתוב בתורת מנחה, אינו אלא לעכב, החזיר אין, לא החזיר לה. But what about a korban mincha where it says the word chok? Let's look at that pasuk. כל זכר בבני אהרון יאכלנה, חוק עולם לדורותיכם, אישה אדוני כל אשר ייגע בהם יקדש. This is in Vayikra chapter 6 in Tzav, that has a whole long section about korban mincha, and it says any male from Bnei Aaron should eat the flour, the leftover flour of the korban, and that's chok olam. So you see, it says the word chok here, which means that according to this new understanding of Rav, that if it says the word chok, then yes, it's necessary. So then that means everything regarding korban mincha should be necessary. But Rav himself said that when it comes to korban mincha, anytime that the Torah repeats itself in one of the laws, then that means it's repeating itself to be me'akev. The laws of the Korban Mincha are mentioned in Parashat Vayikra in chapter 2, and again in Parashat Tzav, chapter 6. And so why is it repeated? Well, Rav says anything that's repeated, that means that that is essential. We can derive from Rav's statement that if it's repeated, then it's essential. If it's not repeated, then it's not essential. That means there are some things regarding Korban Mincha that are essential and some that are not essential. But why should there be anything not essential? After all, we just learned that in our renewed interpretation of Rav, that if it says the word chok, then everything there is essential. And in Korban Mincha, it says the word chok, so that means everything should be essential. Why are you telling me only repeated things are essential and not repeated things? And the answer is Shane hatam dechi ketiba chuka achila ketiba. That's different because the word chok there is said regarding the Kohanim eating the leftover of the meal offering after one does takes the komets. And so that detail, that is the particular detail where it says chok, and that applies only to that detail and not to the rest of the details. Okay, fine. Then let's compare that and apply the same methodology to the lechem hapanim, the showbread from week to week, where it says the word chok, and it says the word chok regarding the Kohanim eating the 12 loaves. Utanan, shene sedarim ma'akibin ze et ze, shene bazichin ma'akibin ze et ze, ha-sedarim v'bazichin ma'akibin ze et ze. And yet we learn in the Mishnah that when it comes to lechem hapanim, the two orders, the two arrangements of 6 and 6, are necessary for each other. You can't just have one without the other. The 2 bowls of frankincense are both necessary. One is not valid without the other. And you need the loaves of bread and the frankincense bowls. Those are required for each other. One without the other is no good. Now now here, why should they all be necessary? If you say, it says the word chok, but the word chok only applies to eating. So then everything else should not be necessary. But the Mishnah says it is necessary. Okay, so you know what? Scratch that. We erase this answer. In fact, anytime it says the word chok, even if it says it regarding eating, that means it applies to all of the laws of that entire paragraph. And so therefore, from the word chok, when it's here regarding eating, whether it's lechem hapanim or whether it's korban mincha, the word chok in fact tells you that everything in the paragraph will be necessary. Fine. So then how come Rav says only things that are repeated are necessary? Shane hatam damar kera migirsha umishamnaha. Korban mincha is different because there it says the words from its groats, its meal, and its oil. Why not just say without the its? Right? Just say mi umishemen, migoresh umishemen. Why migeresh umishemen? Why does it have to say migirsha and mishamna? So we learn from that in that particular detail, it's necessary from the extra hair that you have to have the flour and you have to have the oil, otherwise it's no good. So this actually comes to be a limiting factor. Geresh v'shemen me'akevin v'en davar acher me'akev. Those things are required, and other parts of the Korban Mincha are not required. And because we have that comes to undo the chok. So you have the word chok, and that tells you, oh yeah, everything here should be necessary. But then this particular detail says, oh, this is necessary and not everything else. So that undoes the power of the chok, and then we're left with Rav, who says, okay, so between those two, what you end up, they cancel each other out, and then what you have end up having is anything that's repeated, yes, that will be necessary, but if it's not repeated, then it's not necessary. Gufa, Amar Rav, Kol makom she'echez yedlecha katuv b'Torah mincha eno ela le'akeb. And now we're going to look further into the statement of Rav that any time the Torah repeats a law with regard to Korban Mincha between chapter 6 and chapter 2, and actually other places, as we're going to see, that talk about Korban Mincha, if it repeats a law, that means that law is essential, and the Korban Mincha will be invalid without it. Ushmuel amar geresh v'shemen me'akevin v'en davar acher me'akev. Shmuel seems to disagree with this rule and say no, only regarding the groats and oil, as we saw before. This statement here, migirsha umishamna, it adds that extra its oil, its groats, to teach that is indispensable, but other things are not indispensable. So we ask, v'lishmuel afagav de tana be kera la ma'akeva le. Now, according to Shmuel, does he think that even though the Torah repeats it, still it's not indispensable? Does he disagree with Rav? No, must be that Shmuel agrees with Rav, because why else would the Torah repeat all these laws? Rather, the disagreement between Rav and Shmuel is regarding this phrase. It says in chapter 2 of Vayikra that the Kohen, when he's taking the kometz, he has to have a handful, melo kumso. And then in chapter 6 it says be kumso, with his handful. So why is it changed from melo kumso to be kumso? De Tanya, melo kumso be kumso, shelo yaseh midah la kometz. And there's a braita that teaches that it says be kumso in addition to melo kumso, to teach that you can't make a measuring cup that is the size of a kometz. So what you could do, you might imagine that you take a kometz and you see how much it is, and you put it into a cup, and you make a line. And you say, okay, well, a kometz is this big. You might think that a kometz is just a size, and therefore, if you make a measuring cup with that size, then you could take the kometz with a measuring cup, and you don't have to use your hands. You don't have to get your hands dirty. So melo kumso would just tell you the amount, but be kumso means, no, actually, you have to use your hand. So that's what it teaches. Rav savar ha name tena bekera dichtiv vayakre bet hamincha vaymale chapo mimena ushmoel dorot misha'a la yalfinan. Now Rav says this also has a repetition. Now this is not a repetition between chapter 2 and chapter 6, because it's different and it's teaching us this new law that you have to use your hand, not just a measuring cup. But then it says again in Vayikra chapter 9, the context there is Bayom HaShemini, on the during the consecration of the Mishkan, that Aharon presented the meal offering, and he filled his hand from it. So you see that this is in fact repeated Vaymalech hapo over here, and we already had above the same phrase melo kumso and bekumso, and here it says he fills his kapo mimenu and mimena, and from here we learn that this is indispensable for the future. Ushmuel dorot misha lo yalfinan, and this is where Shmuel disagrees. So that's what the Rav says. If it repeats, then that's the akev. He was referring to this particular law, and then Shmuel said no, just the fact that you need oil and of the flour, that is ma'akev and not something else. He was saying that he disagrees regarding this matter here, that we do not learn a law for all generations from something that applied only once. Misha'ah, that's the consecration of the Mishkan. The laws of the consecration of the Mishkan, they were given and commanded just for one-time use during that time. You're never going to consecrate a Mishkan again. And therefore, in that time, yes, but that's not considered a repetition that we can learn anything from. And therefore, Shmuel says, filling the hand is not something that is indispensable. Now, is this true that Shemuel does not learn a law for generations from something that happened just once? V'hatanan kele halach mekadeshin et halach umidot yavesh mekadeshin et hayavesh ve'en kede halach mekadeshin et hayavesh ve'lo midot yavesh mekadeshin et halach ve'amar Shemuel lo shanu ela midot aval mizrakot mekadeshin dichtib shenehem meleim solet. Here we have a case where Shemuel does learn a law for all generations from actually the consecration of the Mishkan also that happened just once. The Mishnah Masechet Zevachim says that a vessel that's made for liquids cannot consecrate liquids. And if a vessel is made for midot, specifically a measuring cup that's made for dry goods, cannot consecrate, can only consecrate dry goods and not liquids. And something that's made for liquids cannot consecrate dry goods, and something that's made for dry cannot consecrate a liquid. Okay, but Shemuel said that's only true regarding measuring cups. It's a measuring cup. It's used. You're only going to measure liquid with it, or solids like flour with it. However, mizrakot, regarding bowls, these bowls or cups that were used to collect blood. So they're normally made for blood, but those can consecrate. If you put flour in it, it will consecrate the flour and make it holy as a korban mincha. So that does. It's not a measuring cup. It doesn't have lines on it that used for measure, but rather it's a receiving bowl. How do you know? Because when the 12 Nesi'im gave their gifts at the beginning of the Mishkan, it says that they had mizrakim made out of silver, and shenehem meleim solet, and the spoons that they silver spoons and the silver bowls that they donated, both of them were filled with solet. So we see that these silver cups that are normally used to collect blood for liquid, yet they were filled with flour, which is dry. And you can see from this pasuk that something that's made for liquid can, as long as it's not a measuring cup, can consecrate dry goods. So there you go. And now Shemuel said this, even though we're learning a law for generations from something that happened only once. So how could you tell me that Shemuel's methodology is dorot misha lo yalfinan when he does precisely that here? And the answer is Shane Hatam Ditana Be Kera Teresa Zimni. And there it's different because Pasuk says it 12 times. For every single one of Nisim, it says almost the exact same words. Shenehem Milim Solet, and so on. So the fact that it says it 12 times, then you can learn it for generations. But otherwise, you could not learn it for generations. אמרו לרב כהנא ורב אסיר לרב, והרי הגשה דתנא בקרא ולא מעכבה. And now we ask a challenge against Rav. He said that if something's repeated, then it's indispensable. What about hagasha? That's bringing the bowl of flour to the southwest corner, where the pasuk does repeat it. And yet, that's not me'akev. If you didn't do that, it would still be valid. Mantanabe. Now, where do we see that it's repeated? Well, there's one pasuk not quoted here. That's in 2:8. It says he will bring it to the altar, to the mizbeach. Tichtib. And the second pasuk, which is in chapter 6 in Parashat Tzav, says Zot Torah Mincha Hakrebota b'neharon lifnei Adonai. So you see, it's repeated. So if it's repeated, then shouldn't that mean that it's me'akev? But the halacha is that's not me'akev. And the answer is Hahulik bo ala makom hu de'ata. No, it's repeated just to specify exactly where you should bring it. How would you know that it's at the southwest corner? You need both of these pesukim together to teach you that. As we learn in the Baraita, the Tanya. Lifnei Adonai yachol b'ma'arav tamod lomad el penei hamizbeach. El penei hamizbeach yachol b'darom tamod lomad lifnei Hashem. Hakesad magisha b'kerem deromit ma'aravit keneged chuda shel keren v'dayo. Baraita teaches one pasuk, the one in Vayikra 6 says Lifnei Hashem. Now, Lifnei Hashem is here in the Kodesh, and so therefore Lifnei Hashem means in front of the entrance. So it has to be somewhere in front of the entrance, and that would suggest the western side of the altar, so somewhere along the west. So does that mean in the west? Yeah, but the problem is the other pasuk says, the one in chapter 2, says El Penei HaMizbeach, at the face of the altar, in front of the altar. Now, where's the altar's front? That's where the ramp is. The ramp is here to the south. So that means you have to bring it on the south side. So if I says that, then it means I have to bring it in the south. Can I just do the south? No, it says Lifnei Hashem, but that means the west. So which one is it going to be? Take the two Pesukim together, and that means you do it on the southwest corner. And if you do it in the southwest corner, then you have both in front of the Kodesh and also in front of the face of the Mizbeach. And so, you see, it's not a repetition, and therefore it's not me'akev. Rather, the two Pesukim have to be read together to teach us the place. We continue with the Braita, where Rabbi Eliezer teaches, Yachol yagishena lema'arava shel keren o lidroma shel keren. He says, can it be that you would have to bring it either to the west or on the south? To the west of the corner or to the south of the corner. אמרת, כל מקום שאתה מוצא שתי מקראות, אחד מקיים עצמו מקיים חברו, ואחד מקיים עצמו מבטל את חברו, מניחין את שמקיים עצמו מבטל חברו, ותופסין את שמקיים עצמו מקיים חברו. He has a methodology to teach us that anytime you have two Pesukim, where if you fulfill Pasuk A, then you can also fulfill Pasuk B. And if you fulfill Pasuk B, then you'll have to cancel and negate the other one, Pasuk A. When you have such a case, then you should leave aside the Pasuk that if you fulfill that one, you'll have to negate the other one. And instead, grab onto the Pasuk where, if you follow that Pasuk, you can fulfill the other Pasuk. And here's the example. Kishata omed lifnei Hashem b'ma'arav, bitalta el peneh hamizbeach b'darom. When you say take lifnei Hashem in the west, so if you're going to put it in the west, then there's no way you can also be in the south. And then you're going to have to negate that pasuk. So don't do that. Ukshata omed el peneh hamizbeach b'darom kiyamta lifnei Hashem. But if you put it in the south, it can also be you can also fulfill Lifnei Hashem. Now we ask, what do you mean? If you put it in the south, how can I fulfill Lifnei Hashem? If it's in the south, doesn't that mean it's not going to be in the west? Hecha kiyamta, where did you fulfill that? Amar Rav Asher kasabar haytana kule mizbeach basafon ka'eh. Rav Asher explains that according to the Rabbi Eliezer, the mizbeach was in the north, entirely in the north, like this. Other opinions, we've seen this before, say the altar is in the middle or towards the south. But if you say that the altar is in the north, okay, the ramp comes down, but the altar is in the north. That means if you just put it on the south side, over here, even the south side is still in front of the entrance of the Kodesh. The point of in front of the entrance of Lifnei Hashem doesn't mean that it has to be necessarily on the west. You wouldn't need it to be on the west. If the altar, let's say, was further south, then there would be no opening. There's no way for it to be in front of the entrance. Entrance means the entrance way. In front of the opening, then only if it's in the west it would be in the opening. However, if you think that the Mizbeach is all the way in the north, then look, right here, this is south of the altar, but it's also in front of the opening, and so that's what Rabbi Eliezer says. We'll leave it at that. Baruch Adonai le'olam. Amen ve'amen.